Today's lecture is about the extension of the theory of competition within a country, which is what we talked about last time, to competition between countries. And this is important because what we call the theory of international trade is really the theory of competition between countries. Not between countries, to be exact, but between capitals located in different countries. And if you think of it that way, the question is, what is the difference between competitions among capitals located in one country versus capitals located in different countries? And obviously that's not a question of geography. Luxembourg is a country, it's incredibly tiny compared to New York State. So it's not a question of geography, it's a question of something else. And that something else is usually taken to be differences in currency. But then the question arises, why should differences in currency make any difference to the outcome of international competition? And indeed, Adam Smith doesn't believe it makes any difference. Marx seems to imply it doesn't make any difference, though we don't know exactly what he had to say, because any writings he did on international trade didn't appear in volumes 1 through 3 of Capital. So that leaves us the key person who did talk about this issue, and that's David Ricardo. And David Ricardo does an astonishing thing. He changes the rule of competition within a country into a different rule for competition between countries. And that's the first point we want to make, or it's one we want to dwell on. Let's start, therefore, with the ground, which is how does competition within a country operate? Because we need to see what changes when we go to an international one. So, imagine that this room was divided into two industries. One set of industries making corn and the other set making steel. So the first moment of competition, moment meaning the first aspect of competition, is that it equalizes the selling prices of a common good. So all you corn producers will have to pay attention to all your other corn producers, because if your price is too high, customers will gravitate away from you. Same thing for steel. Steel has a different price than corn. The price of steel might be $10 a bushel. Of corn might be $10 a bushel. Price of steel might be $1,000 a ton. So it's different units of things that we're talking about, so different prices. But if the normal price is $30 a bushel, then those of you who sell above it are going to find yourself in trouble. Those who sell below would be better off, but the question is, how far below can you get before you cut your own profitability? So leaving aside that issue for the moment, you can see that there is a pressure towards an equalization of prices in any one commodity. Now, obviously, that means that the price of corn will be roughly $30, plus or minus things according to the degree that you can evade that or persuade your customers that your corn tastes better or whatever. All those second-order differences, but it's going to be determined, there's going to be a central tendency. And the same thing for steel. It'll be $1,000 plus or minus, and that $1,000 is your central tendency. Now, at a high level of abstraction, Smith, Ricardo, Marx, Keynes, and every other economist ignores the variation in relative prices and says, let's talk about just the average prices reflecting everybody's prices. At a more concrete level, I made the argument last time, you have to be careful about that because prices differ according to firms and their cost structure, but that can be explained by competition. But for now, I want to just go back to the more abstract level and say, let's assume that competition enforces a particular price for corn, $30, and a particular price for steel, $1,000, which you as individual producers at your own peril will move away from. Obviously, if you can lower it, that's great, but your costs will get in the way, so to speak. If you go below your cost, you're losing money. If you raise it, your customers will get in the way because they'll be moving away from you. So there are these binding elements to any distribution. Everybody with me here? So that's what we normally call the law of one price. At the most abstract level, we assume it's one price, but it really should be the law of roughly equalized prices. Okay? But that's within an industry. Price of corn is equalized within industry, price of steel is equalized within industry, but these are two different prices. So that's the first moment, the equalization of selling prices within an industry. The second moment, which we talked about last time, is the mobility of capital from one sector to another enforces an equal profit rate. And that's a different thing, because that means that if this $30 price of corn gives you a profit rate of 25%, and the $1,000 price of steel gives you a profit rate of 15%, then new investment is going to be flowing into corn more rapidly than it is into steel. And so the supply in steel is going to start rising relative to the demand for steel, which will bring the price, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. The supply of corn will be rising more rapidly relative to the price, to the demand for corn. And the price of corn will come down, go from 30 to 27, 25, and the price of steel will have to go up from 1,000 to 1,100, 1,200, and so on, until roughly the profit rates are equal. Now, this is an analytical thing, not a real process, because in the real process, everything is changing all at the same time. But the point is that the new prices, the natural prices in the sense of Smith and Ricardo, or the price of production in the sense of Marx, will be something like $36 for corn and $1,200 for steel to make it, no, that can't be right. I said that wrong. $26 for corn, because the price has to come down, and the price of steel has to go up. So there'll be some prices at which the profit rates are roughly equal. And that's the second moment, because it creates equalization of profit rates. Notice that the equalization of prices doesn't tell you what's the correct price. It just says it has to be common. The equalization of profit rates tells you the correct price. It has to be one that gives you a normal profit rate. Correct, not in the sense that it's desirable, not in the sense that anybody wants it, but in the sense that competition will impose it. That's the sense in which Smith and Ricardo call it a natural price. Yes? It is, because the neoclassical story comes from the classical tradition. The difference is the following. The neoclassical story would say at a more concrete level also that all the firms are alike, and Marx doesn't make that argument, neither does Smith or Ricardo, so the prices don't have to be exactly alike. But as central tendencies, yes, they abstract from the variations at a much more concrete level. And that's a point I tried to make last time. The theory of competition in Marx, when it's made more concrete, allows for the fact that new technologies are always entering, and old ones are dying out, so that in fact the technology cannot be always alike in any one sector, in corn or in steel. Okay, everybody with me here? Any questions about this part? Okay, so now let's consider the implication of this. Imagine that a new method of production comes into corn production, and it's lower in cost, which is why you bring it in, after all, because if firms are always struggling with each other, the one with lower costs can cut prices and therefore gain customers. So that lower cost method would mean that the price of corn will be lowered. Right? Competition will make the corn producer with the new cost more successful. And those of you in the back who are still the old-fashioned type, still sticking to your old methods, you're screwed, because the new method will allow the new producer to lower prices, attract customers, and you get either damaged or wiped out. Damaged because you lose customers and you lose profits, therefore. And if you're not able to switch, you get wiped out. So what's the central point there? Same thing in steel. If a new steel producer comes in at lower cost, the new producers gain customers, the old producers lose. They lose market share, they lose profitability, and they have two choices: switch or even go to a better technology, or die. And Something like 60% of new firms, by the way, fail. So this die is not an abstract thing. It's very concrete for most businesses. And that's in good times. It's much higher in bad times. So with that in mind, the lesson that you get from competition is that the more efficient, cost-efficient producer beats out the less cost-efficient producer. In other words, costs are the key factor in success. Those with lower costs will dominate the market, will be the regulating capitals. Remember we talked about that last time? Will be the capitals who appear to be the price setters, but that's because it's the most competitive. So the result of this is that advantages in competition will be determined by lower costs. Or in other words, absolute advantages will dominate competition. If your cost is lower in steel, in corn, then you'll be the winner. If your cost is lower in steel, then you'll be the winner in steel. That means if I were to split this room up into two nations, and some of you in the back row were the higher cost producers of corn and steel, and some of you in the front row were the lower cost producers, so I split the nation this way, because the industries are this way, so the nation is split this way, right? The ones with higher costs would be in trouble because the lower cost ones would win. So the nation with the lower costs would have the absolute cost advantage, and the nation with the higher cost would have the cost disadvantage. That means that the nation with the lower costs would grow more rapidly, employment would rise, output would rise, profitability would rise, and the opposite with the low costs. That's Adam Smith's theory of international trade. And it's a straightforward extension of the theory of competition within a nation, which says that between nations the same results obtain. Okay? Everyone with me here? I saw a hand. No? Okay. So, if Adam Smith already said this, how come David Ricardo created a new view which becomes a dominant one in modern economics? And that's the question we need to talk about today, and also the exact implications of that question. So now we can move to our slides. Okay, so let's start. It's always useful when talking about international trade or any theoretical argument to have some sense of the reference to the reality. Because one of the crucial things about classical traditions is that they focus on the operations of capitalism rather than the operations of some ideal system. So let's start by looking at some things. If you look in global patterns of trade and development, what you find is that trade imbalances are the most common outcome. That is to say, some nations have persistent trade deficits and others have persistent trade surpluses. Today, the most famous country with a persistent trade deficit for 3 decades, right here, United States. Surpluses? China, Germany, Japan, I think Korea also, South Korea. These are the countries with persistent trade surpluses. And if you look at them, we're going to look at them in a little bit empirically, you see these are persistent, not just temporary. And they're persistent whether exchange rates are fixed or flexible. So the issue of different national currencies is not necessarily decisive. Secondly, historically, capital flows are always there right from the beginning because, of course, capital flows, financial capital flows, go hand in hand with money. And money goes hand in hand with trade. Trade is not usually done through barter. Once it develops to a certain point, it's almost always in separate different national currencies and local currencies, but money plays a role, and therefore borrowing and lending and financial capital automatically arise. Thirdly, over time, you see growing international inequality. You see some nations succeeding in linking trade and development, and therefore taking advantage of it, and others suffering from trade, exposure to trade. You see a large reserve army on the world scale with little prospect of reducing it. We talked about this in a couple of lectures ago, about the fact that the idea of the reserve army is that it's a global phenomenon, not a local national phenomenon. And even before the 2008 crisis, the goals for reducing poverty on a world scale are already very modest and not hugely successful either. Ricardo makes a theory which is quite extraordinary because it takes the Smithian theory we're talking about and stands it on its head. It says it is true that within a nation, absolute cost matters. Whoever's got lower cost will win in competition. But between nations, that's not true. Ricardo says that even a country which starts out being uncompetitive in free trade, which starts off with a balance of trade deficit, will end up having balanced trade in the end. And he illustrates it for fixed exchange rates, but it's easily extendable to flexible exchange rates. The key is that in either case, the terms of trade between nations will move in such a way as to make countries that have higher costs competitive in the end. And so the question is, how does that work? Neoclassical theory adds on to the Ricardian argument that free trade makes every nation equally competitive, a further assumption that every nation has full employment. And that's important because any adjustment process will unemploy workers in some industries, and if it doesn't pick them up in another, you could argue that free trade can be damaging. But if you make the argument or make the assumption that all labor is continuously or nearly continuously fully employed, then of course the opening up to trade or suffering from a disadvantage temporarily is not really a disadvantage because unemployed workers will find jobs elsewhere. It'll only be a question of the mobility of labor. Yeah.
So about neoclassical trade theory, because there's a lot of them. Are there any particular papers that are?
Well, this is the standard textbook theory of international trade, though it doesn't come about this way because you do it in a different way. What you assume is start off by saying, let's assume we have two countries named A and B that trade with each other. They have production possibility curves, they have indifference curves, and they choose the outcome which is optimal for them. And that's exactly the same model as the model of trade between individuals. Then you say, lo and behold, free trade makes everybody better. But of course, as Adam Smith long ago pointed out, trade between nations is not trade between nations. It's trade between firms, or it's exports and imports by firms across national borders with the intent of getting profit, and therefore of beating your enemies, of beating your competitors. So the question is really, in Ricardo, how can international trade be equally competitive given that it's undertaken by firms seeking profit? So if you find these general patterns of persistent imbalances, the question is, how do you explain them? The response of heterodox economists, and I'm counting Krugman here politically as a heterodox economist, though actually theoretically he's an orthodox economist, is that the problem lies in the fact that neoclassical theory, which builds on the Ricardian argument, assumes perfect competition and perfect knowledge and perfect markets, and the real world is not perfect. So the deviation from the expectation of zero trade balances comes about through imperfections. The real world is not competitive, it's heterogeneous, has economies of scale, has imperfect competition. Power dominates the market, monopoly power, state power, hegemonic national power. And so in this context, the state becomes an important actor because it can help nations move towards trade surpluses actually, but at least help them in if they have trade deficits. And if you're a Keynesian, especially if there's a problem of unemployment, then the state becomes a crucial mechanism for moving you to full employment, which is to get you the promised benefits of capitalism. And in fact, countries are understood to have succeeded because they've intervened properly in the market. Intervened to correct, hopefully, the imperfections. Now, that's not far from the historical truth. The countries have succeeded have intervened heavily in the market, but the question is, are they correcting imperfections, or are they going against the outcome of the market by, in fact, creating imperfections? That's a very important difference. orthodox economists, and especially conservative economists like Bhagwati, for instance, say, well, you are saying that the real world is not competitive, and that's why you have these problems, and you want to intervene more and make it more uncompetitive. Whereas I say that if you make the world more competitive rather than more uncompetitive, then you could achieve the results because free trade will guarantee it. So the counter argument is that institutions, states, cultural practices inhibit the proper operations of the market, and these operations would give you trade balance. In addition to that, they'll give you full employment. So what you want to do is break up these obstacles. These obstacles are solidified over time by culture and practice and history, and we want to kind of use an icebreaker to smash them up so that the channels of trade are free. I'm stretching that metaphor a lot, I know. So countries which have done well from this point of view are not because they've intervened in the market, because they've intervened in the obstructions to the market. And failures to develop are due to incorrect policies or inappropriate institutions and cultural norms, i.e. non-market friendly institutions. Okay? Yes?
I wanted to ask, so for example, would he argue in favor of, let's say, the private bankers or Wall Street?
I don't know what Bhagwati would say about that, but generally speaking, the argument is that these are due to state interference in the market in the first place, because the state backs banks and gives you the implicit idea that if you are too big to fail and all of that, and this allows you to go over the edge, so to speak. So the solution is not to have more state, but to have less state, let the bad ones fail, and then you'll come back to the proper outcome. Yes?
In terms of the financial market stuff, I mean, I know that most of the monetary economists prior to the crash were arguing.
That's right. They all, from a general point of view, if you believe in the market, you believe that changes in the market move you towards a better situation because they only introduce if they're more efficient. More efficient meaning more profitable, but more profitable generally means better for the system because you can show that from general equilibrium and in trade theory and so on. So the general mindset is actually very clear to the 2008. Now it's a little bit more, people are doing a little bit more dancing when it comes to that particular issue. Okay? All right. So notice that in this, both sets of arguments begin from the idea that free trade will make you equally competitive, but they read the world differently. One is that the world is imperfect, and they both agree that the world is imperfect, but one says you should have state and institutions counter the imperfection of the world, and the other says you should have state and institutions diminish the imperfections, move you towards more markets, not less. So the question comes about not from their common point, which is the neoclassical starting point, nor even their agreement that the world is imperfect, but how do you deal with the imperfection? Do you reduce them, or do you intervene to act against them? So therefore making more intervention rather than less. And that in effect is a division between the liberal and orthodox wings of standard economics. Okay? So I would argue that the heterodox and orthodox approaches, or the conservative and liberal approaches, but a lot of heterodox economists begin from standard trade theory and argue that the world is imperfect and therefore we need to account for those imperfections and deal with them in some way. But that takes it for granted that the orthodox theory is correct on its own grounds. And that's the argument I want to challenge by saying that at least coming from Smith and Marx, the theoretical structure leads to a different argument than Ricardo. I would argue, and I've always argued, and I repeated this in the last lecture, that perfect and imperfect competition are duals of each other. You can't have the idea of imperfect competition without the idea of perfect competition. You can have the idea of monopoly without perfect competition, but monopoly has a different meaning if you have a different theory of competition. So in the theory of real competition, the idea of monopoly has a different notion and a different explanation than it does in the theory of imperfect competition. Monopoly, for instance, is not dependent on small numbers. It's not dependent on small capitals or big capitals. That's not the difference between the two in theory of real competition. So one of the things most striking to me is that the heterodox and orthodox theories are joined together in a common project, which is to preserve the theory of perfect competition as its starting point. Because after all, if you are saying that the world is imperfect, you have nothing to begin from if you don't speak from competition, perfect competition in the first place. So I wanted to go back then to the theory of competition in the sense of real competition that we were talking about last time, with competition is a war, not the neoclassical ballet of firms jiggling on the margin to satisfy demand and consumers. And that as the driver of capitalist processes, you can modify some of the outcomes, but you can't abolish them. Because to abolish them, you have to abolish the profit motive itself. And that means you're talking about abolishing capitalism, not modulating its outcomes. And the first point here we started with is the idea that in real competition within a nation, relative prices are regulated by real costs. By real costs. Now imagine if that principle were to apply to international competition. This is what Smith implicitly argues. And Marx doesn't actually say yes or no, because we don't know what he says about this, but it's implicit also in the argument at Marx. Now let's think through a minute for the consequences of that. Suppose we go back to my earlier story. The back of the room are corn and steel producers that are less efficient in terms of costs, and the front of the room are more efficient. And we open up trade between the two of them. Then Smith and Marx would say, well, the back of the room country is in trouble because it's going to suffer job loss, because it's going to have imports coming in from the more advanced country. So it's going to have a trade deficit. It will not be able to sell very much abroad because its costs are too high. It'll be importing from abroad because the costs there are low. So it'll have a trade deficit. It'll contract. Its employment will drop. Unemployment will rise. All the negative effects of suffering from competition. On the other hand, the front of the room, the more competitive producers, the more competitive country, will have its corn industry and steel industry expanding. Employment will be expanding. Profit will be expanding. And generally things will be better. That is a natural consequence of competition between unequally competitive firms. Everybody understand that? So money is flowing from the back of the room to the front of the room, corresponding to the commodity flows which are flowing in balance the other way. Everybody see that? Well, but Ricardo says, well, what happens if money flows out of the country? The answer is, he applies here the quantity theory of money, the prices will begin to fall in the back of the room. In the front of the room, what happens if all money comes pouring in? The answer is prices will begin to rise. If prices are rising in the more competitive country, it's losing competitiveness. On the other hand, the less competitive country, its prices are falling, it's gaining competitiveness. And you can quickly see that at some point, at least one of the industries, let's suppose corn, will become competitive versus the advanced country. Because prices will have fallen, and one of the countries will cross the barrier first. So at that point, the back of the room will have exports, net exports. We'll be exporting corn to the front of the room, and the front of the room will now be importing corn. But that may not be enough, because still the steel being exported from the front of the room to the back may be enough to have a trade surplus here. In that case, prices will continue to fall in the back and rise in the front until you can see there's no reason for money to flow back and forth. But why does money flow? Because of a trade imbalance. So the mechanism will automatically come to the point where trade is balanced. That's Ricardo's point. It has nothing to do with indifference curves and tangency points or general benefits. It's the fact that free trade organized by businesses for the sake of profit and loss will create money flows that will negate cost differences and make every country in the end, in this case 2 countries, equally competitive. And that's Ricardo's famous wine and cloth example. That's the essence of it. Okay? Everybody with me here? I've done this, I think, more than once, but it's a difficult thing to grasp. But the important point is it comes about through the market. The natural operations of the market will make everybody competitive. Yes.
But so for trade within nations in Ricardo, I mean, he's also assuming the quantity theory of money and Say's law, but then it's a different.
Okay, that's a good question, so let me elaborate a bit. Ricardo is assuming the case of fixed exchange rates under a gold standard. But it doesn't matter, fixed exchange rates will do. The point is that a country which has a trade deficit has to pay in international currency for its difference. Let's call that gold. So golds have to move from that country and the losing country to the winning country. And that gold is convertible back into the local currency. It's going to expand the currency supply. So prices will rise here because money is pouring into this country and money is pouring out of the country with the deficit, so prices will fall. And that's perfectly consistent in Ricardo's case with the backward country. He calls the backward country England because a little joke, Ricardo was Portuguese, born in England, so he has a little joke on us because he says the advanced country is Portugal and the backward country is England. So money is pouring out of England, prices are falling in England, pouring into Portugal, prices are rising, but these are different currencies. Escudos in Portugal, pound sterling in England. And it's gold is the link, but you don't need gold as a link. A fixed exchange rate allows you to convert them. Yeah.
My question is like for within a country, I mean, for trade between regions, Ricardo comes to a different conclusion, right?
Yes,
but
that's right.
Still assuming the quantity theory of money, and with that Say's law. So in that sense,
implicit in there is some idea that within countries the money flows will not cause local price variations to counteract that. And that's a good question. I'm trying to remember how he does that. He does talk about it, but I don't remember at the moment. But yes, usually at the level of a country as a whole, you don't talk about the regional differences. What is true among regions is that the counteracting effect is not money flows, but the mobility of capital and labor. It crosses over to where the region is stronger, expands, it draws in labor. Region that's weaker loses employment, so workers move from one side to the other. And so it's not obvious there'll be a net money flow in that case.
Yeah, but, sorry. But he explicitly argues that even if he would not assume capital mobility to be restricted between countries, he would still...
It's about money, yes.
There must be a money
Yes.
equalization of...
Yeah, I'm sorry, now I remember how he did it. I blanked out for a second, that happens. Remember the law of one price.
Yeah.
The law of one price enforces a common price within a nation for corn and a common price for steel. So the money supply will not have price differential impacts because that will be taken care of with the law of one price. But if it's going to have an impact, it has to have a national impact on the price level.
Yeah.
And that's why it makes a difference between countries and not within regions. Okay, very good question. I blanked out completely. Yes?
How is Ricardo's argument applied to a situation of flexible exchange rates?
I'm going to come to that. So the point is that Ricardo's argument is in the traditional foundation of a gold standard, which is a form of a fixed exchange rate. It's not really a fixed exchange rate, it's temporarily fixed. Because if you look at the history of gold standards, countries are always revaluing their currency in terms of gold. So it's not like a fixed exchange rate, but it's fixed under these movements, at least analytically. Okay? So now consider the same movement. Ricardo doesn't discuss this, but we can analytically see the same movement in terms of flexible exchange rates. We still have a country in the back, which is running a balance of trade deficit. Money has to go out of it because it needs foreign currency to pay for its trade deficit, right? If it needs foreign currency to pay for its trade deficit, its own exchange rate will therefore be devalued in the process, or put it another way, the foreign currency will be revalued because the demand for it, a net demand for it, arises from the trade imbalance. So the country, let's call it Portugal here with escudos, is the one with the trade surplus. Its currency will rise in value because there's a net demand for it coming from the country with the trade surplus. And that will move the exchange rate so that its prices will rise in international terms, whereas the prices of the country, which is got a trade deficit, the pound sterling, the exchange rate will fall, so its prices will fall in international terms, and so it'll become more competitive there, less competitive here. And where does this process stop? It can only stop one place where there's no reason anymore for this imbalance, and that's where trade is balanced. So we're back to trade balance again. And again, the same thing, the result is the same. The free market produces balanced trade. That's Ricardo's hydraulic theory of competition between nations. And that tells us that trade between nations should not be something you should fear. Now, you could argue, and Ricardo never assumes full employment, so it could be that trade will have disruptive impact on employment, and that could be a good reason for blocking it. But neoclassical theory adds the further assumption that you have full employment, in which case that threat is, so to speak, removed. Okay? Question? I see you know. Yes?
So would you agree that, like, if Ricardo still fixes the currency on gold?
That's right. This is a criticism that Marx makes, and that's why we have some implicit idea that Marx disagrees with this. He says Ricardo abandons the cost of production theory of gold. It's not just the labor theory of value, because the price of production is not directly proportional to labor values anyway. But the cost of gold no longer enters into the determination of the price level, as it would be if gold was any other commodity, or in the analysis Ricardo himself conducts within a nation. And so Marx's point is the quantity theory of money is already in contradiction to the theory of relative prices determined by relative cost, because then suddenly gold's cost is not relevant to its price relative to other commodities. Okay, so the point is that the Ricardian theory can be extended and is logically perfectly consistent with flexible or fixed exchange rate. What is happening? In either case, the exchange rate relative to national prices, or more specifically, the export and import prices relative to each other, must be flexible. And they must move in such a way that trade is balanced, which means that they cannot be determined by real costs. They cannot be determined by direct and indirect labor time plus a normal profit on capital. None of that, because that real cost argument would imply that the terms of trade are pinned by their cost structure, which is technological and social. Whereas this says the terms of trade must be liquid, so to speak. They must rise up and down until trade is balanced. Everybody with me here? And that's the secret of the Ricardian theory, is the idea that the terms of trade are divorced from cost. And Ricardo says this, by the way. He says they lie between the limits, two limits that he sets of the relative prices in the two countries. But within that range, they must be flexible in order to satisfy the condition that they balance trade. So now we have an interesting thing. Within a country, the price of corn and steel depends on their relative costs. Between countries, the price of corn and steel depends on the requirement that it must move to create trade balance. And so Ricardo has in fact abandoned his own argument, and certainly abandoned the argument in Smith and implicitly the one in Marx about cost determining relative prices. Everybody with me here? So now, what would Marx say about this? We don't know. Because in fact, even though he read a tremendous amount about trade, and he obviously planned to write about it, and being Marx, he probably had thousands of pages of notes on it, it's not in Capital. So we don't actually know, but we have some clues. One is this argument that was raised that Ricardo is abandoning his own theory of the price level, and any quantity theory story abandons the theory of the price level, which is that the price level is the price of commodities divided by the price of gold in the gold standard. And Ricardo has a gold standard, so how come suddenly the price level is not dependent on the cost of gold? So that's one argument against the quantity theory part, and that we talked about when we talked about the theory of money in Marx. He has an extensive critique of the quantity theory of money. But that doesn't in itself tell us how the gold story, how the trade story works. And there is, therefore, in Marx, there's interestingly a passage or two which goes to the heart of the Ricardian argument and overturns it. And as it turns out, there's the same passage or the same counter-argument that is made by Roy Harrod, professor at Oxford, at a time contemporary of Keynes, and indeed by Keynes himself. So it's interesting to see that you now have a different alignment in this argument. You have on one hand Smith and Ricardo, Smith, Marx, Harrod, and Keynes. On the other hand, you have Ricardo and everyone else. All neoclassical theory, and therefore all of standard theory. So let me explain how the argument in Marx comes about. We start again from the same point. The back of the room is the less competitive country. The front of the room is the more competitive country. The back of the room suffers a trade deficit. Money flows out of the back of the room to the front of the room. Up to that point, it's identically the same argument in Ricardo. But at that point, Marx makes a little comment about this. He says, it is an old humbug, those are his words, it's an old humbug that the entry of money into a country raises its prices. This because he's already critiqued the quantity theory of money. He's already argued that it's inconsistent, and he's done a lot of historical and theoretical argument about that. So he says what happens when money comes into the country is that it increases the liquidity in the country. That is to say, the markets are flush with cash, and because liquidities increase, the interest rate drops. In the country where the money is leaving, on the other hand, liquidity is tightened and the interest rate rises. Now this seems like a minor point, but it's actually historically a very important point, because what does it imply? It implies that the country with the balance of trade deficit will find its capital markets tightening up and its interest rate rising, and the country with the trade surplus will find its capital markets flush and the interest rate falling, and the interest rate is falling in the trade surplus country. It'll be in the incentive of people with money to lend the money to the other country. So what's going to happen? You get a balance of trade deficit and you become an international borrower. In the front of the room, you have a balance of trade surplus, you become an international lender. Now this follows from the logical structure of the arguments about money and markets in Marx, but Harrod makes the same point. In 1937, he revises his book on international trade. He says, well, on rethinking this issue, it seems to me Ricardo was wrong for the following reasons, and he makes exactly the same argument. He's obviously not picked up this obscure passage in volume 3 of Capital, but anyway, he arrives at it logically. What's the consequence of that? The consequence of that is that free trade will lock into place unequal competitive situations. That is to say, the country at an absolute disadvantage will have a trade deficit and will become an international borrower insofar as it can maintain this. And the country with a trade surplus will become an international lender. And we would expect this to be the normal pattern, that deficits and surpluses in trade will be sustained for long periods of time, and the countervailing flow to keep the balance of payments in place will be capital flows, motivated by short-term capital flows, motivated by automatically generated interest rate differentials. Yes?
And then your argument is the current account deficit should be offset by capital account deficit?
That's right. By short-term capital flows. We're not talking about long-term, which is a different issue, foreign direct investment. We're talking about the fact that short-term capital has always been part of trade.
But is that explanation that is
They don't talk about that. They talk about the fact that it may occur temporarily, but the equalization of interest rates will mean the capital flows will disappear and the trade deficit will come back. But since in their case the trade deficit doesn't exist in itself any length of time, they don't have a problem with that because the trade deficit is equalized through movements of the terms of trade. The problem comes about if you recognize the trade deficits are persistent. How does a country sustain a persistent trade deficit? One possibility is that currency will collapse, or the other possibility has to cover it. Has to cover it by international borrowing. The point in Marx is that already you have, and also Harrod, you have an automatic mechanism that will allow you to maintain this within the limits of your buildup of your foreign debt. So it doesn't imply that you can do it forever. If your foreign debt becomes too great, you may become a Greece. But you can hold a high foreign debt for a long time, and you may still get away with that. The US, for instance, has a very large foreign debt, and it has not caused its currency to collapse. Okay, so at least in the time domain of the Ricardian argument, which is some kind of equalization process, the equalization is of interest rates through the mobility of short-term financial flows. But the consequence is that trade deficits are covered by borrowing and trade surpluses are exported as capital exports. Yeah.
But wouldn't capital accounts always set off current account?
Yes, it's a good point. Let me just elaborate on that. The balance of capital accounts as an accounting relation, a balance of payments as an accounting relationship simply says that you have to add something to the numbers to account for the difference. But that's not the same thing as saying the balance of payments is in equilibrium.
Yeah.
The equilibrium requires you to cover a trade deficit with foreign borrowing. Any trade deficit can always be, through the accounting mechanism, treated as a balance of payments because the other side is counted somewhere. But that's not the same thing as saying that there's something actually covering it. Okay? Yes?
There's some, this theory of implied or in Marx's arguments.
You mean the Keynesian argument of the level of output?
Excuse me?
And you mean the Keynesian argument?
The Keynesian argument it could be consistent with the classical Marxian
Yeah,
approach.
I think so. But let me elaborate on that a little. It's a good question. Keynes also argues that trade balances are not automatically eliminated. But he emphasizes another point, which is that the country with a trade deficit will lose output because it's running a trade deficit. Its production will contract, and therefore its demand for imports will contract, and that'll reduce the trade deficit. Same thing in the country with the surplus. It's flush with succeeding from international trade, so that will expand its output, and it'll expand its demand for imports, because the demand of imports is linked to the level of production and output, right? But Keynes doesn't argue that this moves to the point where they're balanced. This is what Marx would call a countervailing effect, but it doesn't eliminate the trade balance. So you can integrate the idea of the output and import propensity adjustment easily into it, but it won't eliminate the problem at hand, which is the inequality in costs and efficiency. Now, if this counter argument is correct, then we would expect to see the terms of trade closely tied to the costs of production of exports and imports, as opposed to the neoclassical argument that the terms of trade move to balanced trade and are unrelated to the cost of production, the Ricardian argument, right? So let's take a look at some empirical evidence. This again is the thing we began with before, the trade balance in Japan, which is a surplus, and the trade balance in the US, which is a deficit. Now, if you believe that Japan's trade surplus comes from the fact that Japan is more competitive on the world market, and the US trade deficit because it's less competitive, then you could explain the persistence of these trade deficits and surpluses by competitiveness, which is a structural problem, not eliminated by movements of capital flows or exchange rates. So if we then go, this is the real effective exchange rate. Remember I said the key point was either prices adjust with the exchange rate fixed, or the exchange rate adjusts with the prices given. So the synthesis of the Ricardian adjustment is that the real exchange rate must do the adjusting. The real exchange rate must move you to trade balance. So this is the real exchange rate in the United States over time. This is the real exchange rate in Japan over time. But notice that did not actually eliminate, you go back one more, sorry, you just go, yeah. Notice that same movement did not eliminate the trade surplus and deficit, it's the imbalance. Why is the real exchange rate moving then if it's not moving to make everything equal? And on the classical argument, it's moving because it's reflecting the underlying costs. So what we have here, the next one, is the real exchange rate and the underlying real unit labor costs of the corresponding commodities in the US and the US trading partners. You can actually construct that because the BLS very kindly calculates unit labor costs. Now these are unit labor costs, not direct and indirect costs, and not natural prices, for which we don't have data, so this is a very rough approximation, but it's quite striking that the real unit labor costs move in a way very consistent with the real exchange rate. That would be consistent with the classical argument that the real exchange rate is regulated by the underlying costs. hang on, I want to come back to that. So here we have also in the US 2 big episodes of divergence. And both of these correspond to very sharp capital inflows into the United States from abroad. This one is a great capital flow from Latin America in the 1980s, which as they seek to escape the crises in Latin America, and they come into the US, it pumps up the real exchange rate, but notice that then it comes back down. And overshoots. This is a typical classical idea of regulation. It's overshooting and undershooting, never balance. The same thing here, the famous dot-com bubble, the prices rise, tremendous rise in stock prices, real estate prices, and asset prices in the United States, which attracts a lot of capital, but then it brings it back down to the level. Okay, so this data is perfectly consistent with the idea that real exchange rates are regulated by real costs. Okay. This is the same data for the same issue for Japan. Japan's real effective exchange rate is the dark line, and the adjusted real affected unit labor costs adjusted for tradable, non-tradable goods is a dotted line. And again, you see a correspondence which would be something you would expect from classical theory. Now, what is this classical argument saying? The classical argument is saying that the real exchange rate, which is the price in a country times its exchange rate divided by the price in the foreign country, is roughly equal to the real unit labor costs of the two countries Okay? Now this is just this thing, but it has an implication, which is that E is the nominal exchange rate. So what that tells us then is that if we write rates of change here, the rate of change of the exchange rate will be equal to the rate of change in the unit labor costs, relative unit labor costs, minus the rate of change in of the price levels, relative price levels. Because the rate of change of the price levels plus the rate of change of the exchange rate is equal to the rate of change of real unit labor costs. So we can take the price level over to this side, and we have here these little hats. And the hats mean percentage rate of change. Everybody okay with this? Just a straightforward decomposition of the classical hypothesis. Okay? Now, if this is so, then we would expect that countries with, the real unit labor costs we know move slowly. Why? Because real wages move slowly relative to each other in the country, and productivity moves slowly, meaning that it moves small. So you're talking about these variables on the order of 0 plus or minus 3%. Hang on, let people catch up to that. So this variable is, let's say, plus or minus 3%, because remember this is the relative variation. So even a country whose real costs changed over time 5%, and another country 2%, the difference would be 3%. Right? Everybody understand that? It's a slow-moving variable because it reflects technical change and changes in the social structure of wages. That implies that countries, if they have low relative inflation rates, this part will dominate. But if they have high relative inflation rates, the inflation rates will dominate. That's a necessary consequence of the argument itself. I saw a hand, so let me, yeah.
Just the exchange rate, you're talking about it between the rest of the world, so like versus a basket of other currencies?
Yes. In this case, I said that the country in question and the other side is all trading partners. It's not bilateral.
No, I'm talking about E though.
E is therefore an effective exchange rate, meaning a nominal effective exchange rate. It's the exchange rate of the dollar versus a basket of the currencies of the trading partners, which are published, easily published data. Yes?
So it is possible in this analysis to consider the nominal exchange rate to be the...
Indeed. And we're going to do that right now. I'm going to get to it in 1 second. Yes?
Mathematically, the price ratio, or,
These are relative inflation rates. Think of them that way. This is relative inflation rates.
though that the relationship between those two would have to be fixed in order for that math to work.
No, everything is changing. This simply says that the product of the price and the relative price and the exchange rate has to be equal to the product of the relative real unit labor costs. Therefore, the rate of change of the exchange rate, which is appreciation or depreciation, will depend on two factors, all of which are changing, or both of which are changing. So there's no assumption about anything being constant here. This follows simply from competition extended to international. Think of it this way. If this was one country, the exchange rate would be 1. The relative price of goods in one region or one type of good to another, exports to imports, will be equal to their relative unit labor costs, right? A real indirect and direct and all of that, but based on costs. So this will be straightforward. To extend it, you have to convert the prices into the same units, and then you're exactly in the same domain, so to speak, as within a country. But to do that, if you have different currencies, the E has to be the ratio of the foreign currency to your currency in order to make this in foreign currency and this in foreign currency, so the ratio is without units. And that's exactly the same principle. So you can imagine how classicals thinking of this way would see that, obviously. Now, this particular result is very well known, and it's often cited as a implication that the theory of the hypothesis of purchasing power holds. We need to go down one. This is from Barrow's textbook on macro, and he says, look, the exchange rate is determined by relative price inflation only. He leaves this part out, the cost structure, because his theory is that it's all due to relative prices. The real exchange rate is constant. If it's constant, then it depends solely on inflation. The nominal exchange rate will depend solely on relative inflations, and he provides this evidence. Inflation rate in Argentina in this period, 40.8, percentage change in the exchange rate, 39.3. In my case, this would mean the inflation rate of 40.8 would mean the exchange rate would be negative 39.3, but he uses the exchange rate in the other way, the reciprocal of it, so it's a positive, okay? You can always write exchange rates in two ways. Your currency in terms of the foreign currency, so it's dollars per international currency, or international currency per dollars. Here, this is international currency per dollars. So that converts US exports into international prices. But anyway, whichever way, you'd expect a close correspondence if the inflation rate is high. 26.6, 26.4, 47, 44, and you go through. As you get the lower ones, the percentage deviations are bigger. But broadly speaking, you see a correspondence, and that for him proves that real exchange rates are constant, because if they were constant, this part would be 0 and there'd be a 1-to-1 correspondence. That's called purchasing power parity hypothesis, that prices are the same in two different countries regardless of their exchange rate, which means that therefore the exchange rate goes up, the prices must go up in the same degree, or vice versa. If the prices go up, the exchange rate must adjust. So but this, I read this as exactly the different result, which is that it's the result of a classical explanation of the real exchange rate, which is that it's not constant. And we can see that it's not constant. If you go back, Catherine, to the real exchange rate, yeah, you can do it here. You can see the real exchange rate, which is a solid line, is not constant. So purchasing power parity, which is a hypothesis saying it's constant, has been widely recognized to be false. Nonetheless, it is used in textbooks because, as they say, it's extremely convenient as a hypothesis because it gives you tractable results. But you don't need that. You need a hypothesis explaining why it's moving, and if you can go down to the Japan one, or in the case of Japan, why it's rising, it's because of the cost structure. Now notice, Japanese costs rising relative to its trading partners is not the same thing as saying that Japanese costs are higher than their trading partners. This is perfectly consistent with their costs being lower than their trading partners, which is why they trade surplus, but they're losing advantage. Everybody understand that? These are index numbers, so their level means nothing, and we cannot, there is data to construct levels, but that's very hard to make consistently useful. So these are index numbers, always 2002 equal 1000, so we can only talk about the trend, we can't talk about the level. Common difficulty with index numbers. But we can explain this data perfectly well from the classical hypothesis. Questions?
It's possible to consider the structuralism.
Indeed. As I said, if you come from a markup pricing kind of argument, then the inflation rate will be linked to costs, and the exchange rate will affect your import costs at least. It usually doesn't affect the wage costs, but import costs. So there'll be a feedback component. But that depends on the theory of price, which is not given here. This argument comes from the idea that relative prices are related to relative costs, and you could derive a similar argument by saying that markups are stable, in which case relative prices depend on relative costs. So you can't distinguish this level between those two arguments. And that's why I talked about the theory of money in general and the theory of prices in general. To do that, you have to have a theory of inflation, which, alas, in this class I don't have time for. But in my book. Any other questions? So let's stop and think about the general implications of this kind of argument. You can keep it up, it's okay. If it's true that competitiveness determines trade balances, or at least is a principal determinant, because we also know that the level of output and affects the level of imports. Through income, output means higher income, income means more imports, other things being equal. So there is that Keynesian feedback loop. But if competitive advantage and disadvantage are crucial, then the story of free trade is different, and the story of development is different. If you believe the neoclassical story, then the proper way for a country to develop is to open itself up to the markets. It's simple. You just have to figure out how to survive in the storm that follows if you are backward. But you open yourself up, you'll become more competitive, your costs will drop if you have a trade deficit, and your prices will drop, and therefore you'll become more competitive at some point without having to change your technology, without having to change your wage structure, without having to become more competitive in the business sense. You'll become more competitive as a nation. If, however, this counter-argument from Smith, Marx, Harrod, and Keynes is correct, then opening yourself up to trade, if you are not competitive, is like climbing into the ring with Mike Tyson with just a few video lessons on how to box. And that is an important historical issue. Now I want to loop back to what I started with, the important historical issue. People argue, coming from one side, that nations that were successful were the nations who were taking advantage of imperfections in the market, and others argue the nations who were successful were the nations who were allowing free trade to work. But if free trade does between nations exactly what it does within the country, then if you want to get out of that low-level trap, you have to have something that breaks that. And one possible thing is the intervention of the state to nurture industries to become competitive. Hajun Chang, in his book called Kicking Away the Ladder, makes an argument, which made him quite famous, saying that every developed country of the world, the US, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, South Korea, Switzerland, I've run out of countries, but all the developed countries intervened in the market to nurture their own competitive industries, to make them competitive in order so that when they got onto the world scale, they could succeed in foreign competition. Now, in that case, what we're talking about is a theory that says that free trade will not make you equal, but you can intervene to modulate the outcomes of competition by going against free trade. He has, Hajun has a wonderful little talk, or he used to. He would take out American currency and he'd say, who is this? And he'd say James Madison or George Washington or whatever, Alexander Hamilton, and he would read a quote from them saying how it's very important not to allow free trade to damage our country, and we will, when we get to the top of the ladder, we will also support free trade, but right now, don't fall for those English the nonsense from England that free trade is good, because they only started saying that they themselves when they were already at the top. Secondly, from this point of view, it makes perfect sense why countries like Japan and South Korea and China, not the United States and Germany and France and Italy, intervene in a systematic way to enhance the competitiveness of their industries on a world scale. Take a look at the book by Alice Ampton called South Korea, Asia's Next Giant. She was a colleague here. She used to be a member of this department before she moved to MIT. And her book is about how South Korea transformed its industry in a systematic manner in order to be successful in free trade, in order to be successful on the world market. Okay? Any questions on this? Yes?
So, what if there's a country that has a limited good? If everyone's making wheat, then this makes sense. But if only one or two countries are making, let's say, diamonds?
Well, obviously, if only one country is making a diamond, it has a competitive advantage, absolute advantage in diamonds, right?
A few, let's say.
Yeah. Then the question becomes which diamond mines are going to be surviving and which are not. One could argue that there are many countries of the world that are highly, potentially productive in terms of agriculture, but they're not in terms of actual trade because the agriculture is not developed enough to be competitive on a world scale. But if you believe in the free trade argument, their problem is they don't have enough free trade. If you believe in this argument, their problem is they have too much free trade. So that's an important policy issue that affects the lives of millions, if not billions, of people across the globe. So it's not just an abstract argument here. It is really fundamental to the whole issue of neoliberal policy, which has been, since the 80s, enforcing free trade, so to speak. It's an odd thing to say that free trade has to be forced on people, but it is exactly what neoliberal policies have done through the IMF, through the World Bank, through the WTO, and through the power of the big nations to punish you if you don't do it. That's the key point. I saw a lot of hands, so let me go around. Yes?
There's a really good movie called Life and Death, which touches exactly this topic.
Life and Death by, do you know?
It's an American filmmaker, but it's in Jamaica, basically.
Yes, it's Jamaica. Yes, I think I've seen a portion of that. Yeah, if I could do this course with enough time, I would just have movies all the way through. But anyway, that'd be a perfect illustration right now. Yes, I've seen a portion of that movie. Yes. Hang on, let me go around a little bit. Yeah.
What about the approach of what's said about the seeking ladder? Like you get in a ring with Mike Tyson, sooner or later you're going to learn how to box.
Oh, well, you could be dead.
Like,
I doubt that very much. I mean, I really doubt it very much. I don't know if you ever boxed, but I can tell you for a fact that it's not likely.
Turn around and beat somebody else.
Well, yes, if you survive, and that's a key question. But it's not a trivial issue. I mean, suppose that Jamaica goes into the world market, as it did, and then doesn't survive. What do you say? Well, sooner or later you'll get there. It doesn't follow. The history of the world is full of nations and regions that don't make it, because extinction is also a possibility, or at least being stuck in a period of depression and unemployment and lack of jobs. And then people leave looking for jobs. So the key, again, argument is that if you believe that free trade makes you competitive, then perhaps you would argue that you just need to tough it out. But if you believe that you can get knocked out and permanently knocked out, then it's a different story entirely. Yes?
I was thinking about the whole, I heard on the news that apparently China now has a new, there's been by the...
Okay, so let me back up a bit. You raised an important question which I was coming to, but let me do that now, then I'll come back to that part of the issue. There is, in the United States today, and possibly also in Europe, a drumbeat of articles by everyone from the right to the left, and the left also. I just saw a recent article from a left institute in Washington said the same thing. China is interfering in its exchange rate. What's the evidence? It has a trade surplus. But on what theory is a trade surplus due to interference in free trade? When you ask that question, they say, well, it's obvious. Free trade will make you competitive, and so you must be interfering. And this is the left talking, not just the right. This is Paul Krugman, a recent article from, I think it was Economic Policy Institute, which is the big left sort of thing, but I may be insulting them, but I'm pretty sure that those are the two main people there. And you find the same argument in the Wall Street Journal, you find it in the FT, you find it in the Newsweek, and you find it in the New York Times. It's clear, everybody says, it's clear China is interfering. And when you look in the next paragraph, you say, and because they have a persistent trade surplus, so it's obvious they must be interfering. Now that, to me, is not clear. It's dependent on the presumption that free trade would make you competitive. And so it's not actually, and you look in there and say, what's the proof? And the answer is, they have a trade surplus. They're cheating. But it could be that they have a trade surplus because they're actually more efficient. They have lower costs because they have very low wages and pretty high productivity. And that's why they have a trade surplus. In which case they're not cheating, they're actually competing. And the complaint, therefore, is not against cheating, but against their being too competitive. And what you want China to do is to raise its wages. Because if you raise wages, the implementing labor standards, which is a real and an important issue, has this further virtue that it reduces China's competitive advantage. So ironically, even though they're saying they're cheating, what they really want to do is to go back to a classical argument that you want to raise their costs. And business, by the way, businesses don't necessarily believe neoclassical textbooks either way. They have to live by the cost structure. And so they say, they're pretty much clear about it, that if China's wages rise, McKinsey Institute has a paper talking about how China is going to lose its competitive advantage in the next 15 or 20 years because its wages, low as they are, cannot be kept that low, and they have been rising, and the US wages are falling or stable. So productivity is rising and unit labor costs are falling in the US, and they're rising in China, and within 15 or 20 years China will lose a good portion of its competitive advantage. Yet you cannot make that argument from the neoclassical point of view because that argument doesn't have any meaning. Competitive advantage doesn't matter. What matters is that trade will come automatically balanced. Okay? So these are the policy issues of the day. And I found it, what I found it almost impossible is to talk to anybody about the theory of trade because it's so obvious to everybody that free trade makes you competitive, and therefore the absence of trade balances means that somebody's interfering. Now, who's the interfering? You can't say the US is interfering to cause its trade deficit, so it must be that Germany, Japan, and China are interfering. And historically, the US has always blamed its trade deficits on Germany, Japan, South Korea, and now China. Again, that follows logically from the theory. Yes, and they're important issues because the US is a hegemonic country. Yeah. Trade is quite small relative to the US, even though there would be major disruptions if there wasn't trade. There wouldn't be such a major disruption if the trade was balanced in some form, right? So And the second is US is an international reserve currency, which gives it's a gold producer basically, so that's another advantage it can have to cover its trade deficit. There's a need for the export of its dollars. But there does raise the question of what the limits are. If you go on websites talking about the outcome of, let's say, Fed policy in the outcoming period, you find that many people are very worried, especially conservatives, that there's going to be a collapse in the dollar. Because they say, well, I mean, how could you have this trade deficit for so long, this debt piling up for so long, and people continue to accept the export of dollars? At some point, they might turn around and say, this is not a currency you want. They switch into other currencies. The yen is a good currency. Right now, the Chinese currency is pretty good, but there's also gold. And typically, the jump in the price of these other currencies comes in anticipation of the collapse of a local currency. It's hard to imagine the US dollar collapsing for most Americans, but it's not hard to imagine historically, if you were British, you see that the British pound could collapse. And in fact, every hegemonic country goes through that phase at some point. The US may not be there, but it might. It's a really hard thing to anticipate because these are lightning quick phase changes, where some people start to believe that you shouldn't want to hold a dollar, and then other people start to not hold the dollar. I have read in the New York Times that the Chinese have been for some time getting rid of their extra dollars and in getting rid of their piling up of American assets in general by trading them generally, secretly, so that they're hedging their bet. It wouldn't be surprising. I mean, it would certainly be plausible. Okay? Unfortunately, I don't have any further information, otherwise I'd be trading myself, but nobody ever tells me anything about that kind of stuff in detail. Any other questions? Yes?
How do you introduce the story of replication of production tools?
Well, the American companies are very competitive in that. The trade balance doesn't imply that everything in the US can't be sold abroad. It says the US is buying more from abroad than it's selling. But the US is a huge exporter. It's a big country. And its exports play a role in every country of the world, especially technology and information technology and machinery. Japan has a wonderful, Germany has a wonderful machine tools industry, steel industry. That kind of thing is still there. The question we're talking about is the balance. I'm not arguing, I don't mean to argue, that the US is not competitive, is uncompetitive in every good. But obviously, on balance, its trade is running a deficit. And that means something. Does that answer your question?
No, because my question was going back to what they say about the sinking ladder, like you open your country, America will come.
Yes, but that's not the Ricardian argument. It's not about through technical change. The Ricardian argument is through without any change, you get trade balance. It's a different argument to say that opening up a trade will make you learn new technology. But ask yourself this, you open up trade and you learn how to make steel. It doesn't follow that you'll be able to make steel more efficiently than the US. You have to, in order to balance that trade, not only adopt their ideas, you have to do better so that your trade moves from a deficit to a surplus, right? And then the question is, who's the you? Country is not an individual with a welfare curve and a production possibility curve. It's a bunch of capitalists who are trying to do something, or a bunch of producers at least are trying to do something. And they may not be able to combat the enormous developed power of a developed country on their own without support. You have to have infrastructure, you have to have technology, you have to have training, you have to have all of those things that feed into the you. And if you don't have them, you might individually as an entrepreneur break through in this area or not, but you're not going to be able to combat on the big scale. And that's precisely why many countries or many people argue that development requires a concerted effort to break out of that low-level trap. That's why countries that are stuck like Jamaica in a low-level trap simply cannot break out without the concerted effort. And that's why it is argued Japan and China and Germany in their time made creation of that infrastructure and of the training and of the knowledge and all of that possible. By the way, a further issue is patent protection and property rights, especially intellectual property rights, is a way of preventing that. Because in the good old days, you could steal from anybody you wanted. That was the whole point. Now you get penalized for doing what they used to do. And that is because the winning countries want to prevent precisely this exchange that you're talking about. They'll sell it to you, but only on terms that'll give them some benefit. And those terms may not be sufficient for you to break free as a country into the competitive market. The main point is that nothing is given. Here, you have to speak about the social process that creates technology, and the whole foundation for technical change is an ongoing thing. Further point, it's not enough for you to catch up. You have to go beyond. But it's not enough for you to go beyond. You have to keep going beyond because they're also moving. So it's not enough to go beyond. You have to have the structure that keeps you moving faster than them if you want to gain further advantage. Now, who is the them? The them is everybody else in the developed world. We have enormous resources at hand. So it's possible, but it's not likely that it can be done just through individuals operating, because technology is a very collective thing. It's integrated. Other questions? Yes. Yes, there are a lot of things I don't touch upon, but what I've chosen in this course is to emphasize the laws of the free market for a reason. Because once we talk about the laws of the free market, we have a divergence in the theory of the laws, and therefore a divergence in the consequences of the impact of intervention. And here we've been talking about the impact of intervention. If you believe that the free market makes you equally competitive, you want the state to stay out of it, or if you wanted to come in, you wanted to come in to make things more market-oriented. If you, however, believe that the free market punishes the weak and rewards the strong, then you want to get strong, and that getting the strong may be to go against the free market in order to get your strength up so that you can enter that ring. And that's something, that's why I mentioned Ha-Joon Chang, because he essentially makes this argument without dealing with the theory. He deals with the historical practice. Yeah.
So you say that, aren't you sort of falling into the same pitfall of departing from an idea of a perfect market or perfect competition? Because Ha-Joon Chang, I think, has a book, things that they don't tell you, 20 things that they don't tell you about capitalism or something like that, in which he says there is no such thing as free market.
Yes, that's a different thing of the state as the base of a market. And I'm not using the word free market in the same sense as perfect competition. The question is, what is the inherent set of outcomes from market competition? And I believe market competition is the dominant force in the world. Absolutely the dominant force in the capitalist world. That doesn't mean it operates in the same way in different theories. So in that sense, I'm definitely against, or I'm making an argument different from imperfectionist theories. And I tried to make that point earlier. The standard view on the left is that free markets operate in a particular way, but we don't have free markets. We've never had free markets. We'll never have free markets, so we need to intervene to compensate for the absence of free markets. That is not the same thing as saying that real competition, which always required the state as part of its substructure, so to speak, has the same outcomes as perfect competition, and therefore intervention has the same outcomes in both theories. That's my main point. So yes, you're quite right. If you approach it from this point of view, of the market as a merciless enforcer of rules, which is the classical argument, then you need to bring in the question of how to view state history, social history that way. And I would argue that's precisely what this tells you how to do. Why does Japan succeed by doing what seems to be going against the laws of the free market? Because in fact it understands that international competition has certain outcomes, and it wants to prevent them. And in the process made itself successful. It doesn't always work that you do that. Blocking competition, international competition, can allow you to just become locally inefficient and therefore requiring more and more support. There's a good book by Vivek Chibber called Locked in Place that discusses the political and social history of this issue, comparing Korea, South Korea, and India, which begin roughly on their path to development in the same time period, roughly within the same year. Both have an educated elite, both have all the foundation for it, But India doesn't come onto the world market in a successful way till 20, 30 years later, whereas South Korea shoots up. So the question he asks is why? And his answer is precisely has to do with social relations and institutional relations and so on. But that's different from the question of what the market does if you expose yourself to it. Yeah.
So, follow-up question would be, do the dynamics, internal dynamics of the...
Some outcomes are modulated, but I would argue that they're not eliminated. I mean, how do you eliminate competition? You can come in and protect yourself from competition, but you can't prevent the others from trying to compete against you. You can raise barriers. Those barriers have costs. And so those costs have to be imposed on you to protect yourself. Now, you could say, okay, I need this protection so that I can be in good shape so I can climb into the ring with Mike Tyson, and some of us are going to make it out of that ring alive. So we'll train those people, right? Okay, that's fine. But you have to, at some point, put them in the ring. Or you have to build bigger and bigger walls to keep the rising tide of competition, because it is rising, because they're getting better. So it's not enough to just protect. You have to catch up and surpass if you want to step over into that ring. And that's a tricky issue. Let me give you an example here. One of my former students, who's now very high level in the UN, did her dissertation on the argument in India that women should be tracked into activities such as carpet and weaving and all that, which were low-wage labor, because they were very efficient at it and the cost was low, and it allowed them to get out of the oppressive conditions at home and in the local regions, and in the process it provided employment for them. So tracking them into these was good because it allowed them to get jobs and get incomes. But the question we were asking was, how long can that survive? Because that low income, low cost activity was low cost only compared to the costs everywhere else. But those costs were going down. So what's going to happen here? Are you going to lower their wages? Or are you going to have to mechanize? If you mechanize, then precisely they are in the process of competing with the machinery and moving into the arena that you were trying to protect them from in the first place, which is leaving them in handicrafts and hand labor. And indeed, that's what happened to many of those activities. They simply got eliminated by competition. So competition works as long as you're talking about, it doesn't have to be free markets, it's sufficient markets. That's the key point, sufficient markets.